One afternoon in June of 1993, a movie director named Xie Jin sat on a couch in a production studio in the city of Yinchuan, China. He was with a few members of his production team, and they were in the middle of auditioning what felt like the 100th terrible actor for the lead role in the film that he was directing. However, this was not an ordinary lead role. The lead role for this film was going to be a dog. So the movie was called An Old Man and His Dog, and it was based on this popular novel about a man living during a period of war in China with his loyal yellow dog. People had really responded to the story in the book because it captured just how devastating war could really be on rural communities. And a lot of people in China had seen themselves in the characters in the story. At this point, Jin had already cast the film's human actors, but the dog's role was by far the hardest to fill, and obviously the most central to the movie. He and his team had hosted a bunch of casting calls already and advertised to the public to ask if anybody had a dog that looked like the one that was in this book. And tons of people had answered this ad, but none of the dogs that they brought in were good enough for the film. And the reason for that is Jin knew, the dog needed to look the part, but it was more than that. Like, the dog also had to be compelling and charismatic despite being a dog. I mean, this dog was the hero of the story and the soul of the movie. So it really had to project loyalty and bravery and goodness on screen and sort of come across also as gentle and sweet enough that audiences fell in love with it. But now, as Jin watched yet another anxious, poorly trained dog actor scurry around the room, he felt this wave of anxiety. Jin was starting to feel worried that, maybe the reason all these dog actors were not working out is because maybe the perfect dog just didn't exist. And if that was true, then his movie would not be good. Like, he would have a bad actor in the lead role and it would flop. And for Jin, that really represented sort of like a worst case scenario for him. So, decades earlier in the 1950s, Jin had been this prolific director in China, and he had won many prestigious awards. But during China's Cultural Revolution, which was a period of unrest in the country in the 1960s and 70s, Jin had been ostracized by the public because of his largely unpopular political views. And ever since then, he had been struggling to regain his status as a celebrated filmmaker. And so the chance to adapt this brilliant novel, which was touching and tragic and already beloved by the public, was like his opportunity to prove himself and get back on top. And he knew that, if the movie failed, he was old enough that he would very likely not get another chance like this, and he might be completely forgotten about. And so now, as this dog's audition came to an end, and obviously this dog was not going to be a fit, Jin's just sitting there feeling kind of hopeless, and Jin's producer walked up and led the anxious dog and its owner out of the room, and Jin at this point was so busy worrying to himself about how this movie was destined to fail now that he barely noticed his producer bringing in the next dog and owner. But when Jin looked up, and he actually looked at the dog that was now standing in front of him, the 101st audition he was seeing that day, he just stopped and practically gasped, because sitting in front of him, right in the middle of the room, was now this new dog that looked exactly like how he had pictured the one from the book. It was shaggy and big and yellow-haired and had this eager-to-please look in its eyes that made Jin instantly feel like he was connected to it. The owner who had come in with this dog was a young, friendly guy in his 30s who introduced himself as Chung, and he explained that he had just started a dog training and breeding company. And so having his dog cast in this movie would be a really big deal for his new business and would definitely help get his name out there. So this was like high stakes for him too. Now, Jin did not love the fact that, Chung had just begun this dog training and breeding business, so it meant that very likely he was pretty inexperienced with this dog actor. However, when the actual audition began, any worries Jin might have had completely vanished. Throughout the entire audition, Chung skillfully directed this dog like he'd been doing it for his whole life. And the dog was obviously really smart and followed all the commands. He was, really well trained. And it just seemed like the dog was really devoted to Chung, because it really did exactly what Chung asked every single time. But more than that, as Jin watched this audition, it really felt like this dog didn't just look the part, it acted the part. This was the dog he wanted in his movie. And so after only a few minutes, Jin stopped the audition and he told Chung, "You and your dog have got the job." They began filming the movie just a few days later, and basically, as soon as they started, all the worries Jin had had about maybe this movie not doing so well just completely vanished. Because, just like he'd anticipated, this dog really was perfect. It obeyed his owner, Chung, without hesitation, same as it had during the audition. And the camera just loved this dog. The dog had this very sweet, tender quality to it that really came out anytime the actor playing the old man interacted with it, which is exactly what Jin had hoped for. And so Jin knew this dog was going to steal the hearts of everybody who saw it on screen. This was exactly what he wanted. And so Jin just disappeared into the making of this film. He poured all his focus, all his passion into each and every frame. And by the time production finally wrapped a few months later, Jin was sure they had just made a masterpiece. And Jin was right. The movie was released to rave reviews, and it seemed like everyone who saw it loved it. Not only was An Old Man and His Dog recognized as one of China's top films of the year, but also it was widely regarded as an instant classic worldwide. And so Jin knew that he had accomplished his goal here, and that his career now had a new beginning. A year and a half later, on an evening in late January of 1995, Jin was reading a script in his living room in the city of Shanghai, China. So the huge success of An Old Man and His Dog had meant that Jin was once again in very high demand, which meant he got lots of phone calls and people wanted him to read their scripts, and he was basically just getting to pick and choose what he wanted to do next. This was like best case scenario for him. So as Jin is sitting there, when his phone rang, because his phone again was ringing all the time these days, he assumed it had to be one of his producers who wanted to talk about one of the many scripts they were looking at. However, when Jin answered the phone, it was one of his producers, but what they said to him completely stunned Jin. His film, An Old Man and His Dog, apparently was being banned. Jin, when he heard this, he just sat there for a moment, unable to actually respond to this. This didn't make any sense. Why in the world would this wholesome movie about an old man and his dog get banned? This wasn't political in any way. This was a wholesome, family-friendly movie. So China did ban films with some regularity. Sometimes it was the content itself within the film could be viewed as being, unduly influential on the public in a negative way, and so that could cause the film to be banned. Or it could just be that the people who were in the film or the producers who made the film, they could have done something in their own personal lives that was viewed as being, unduly influential on the public, in a negative way. They could have had some scandal. And then because of that scandal, they could have their work banned. So the movie itself could be okay, but the people involved in the movie, they're bad, so movie must be bad as well. So that was sort of relatively normal. But Jin's film, An Old Man and His Dog, had been out for over a year at this point with no issues. It was viewed as this masterpiece. Everybody loved it. Everyone had all these great things to say about it. So it couldn't have been that. The movie itself clearly was okay. And Jin, he had in his former life, he had been politically divisive and it had cost him dearly, but that was in the past. He had not done anything political, not in this movie, not in his personal life now. He had not done anything that was scandalous that could potentially warrant, this film being banned. And so Jin's what in the world could have caused this movie to be banned? What is going on here? And his producer said, you're not going to believe it, but it's the dog. It would turn out, a few days before the producer called Jin, Chung, the owner of the dog who had starred in this film, had been arrested for being a serial killer. Over the last 5 years, he had murdered at least 5 people. But that was not actually why this movie was being scrutinized. The movie was being banned because of how Chung disposed of the bodies of the people he killed. After murdering and dismembering his victims, he would take those body parts and feed them to his dog, the star of the movie. And so ultimately, the Chinese government banned this film because they knew from now on, now that the news broke about Chung being a killer and what he did with the bodies, that you couldn't watch this movie and watch that dog without thinking about the fact that that dog was eating people. Jin would go on to make a few more movies, but they never really worked, and ultimately his career kind of stalled, and he never reached the heights that he had hoped for. However, Jin had always hoped that one day he would leave a truly lasting mark on the Chinese film industry. And he did. because he'll always be known for casting a flesh eating dog in his cinematic masterpiece. One evening in December of 1966, an 8-year-old girl named Elaine Ellery hurried after her parents as they walked towards this large factory in Norfolk, England. Elaine was so excited about the night ahead here that she was literally skipping as she walked along. So, this factory was where her father worked, and they were having their big annual Christmas party. And for the first time ever, Elaine was being allowed to go, and she couldn't wait to see what was inside. So Elaine was really close with her dad, because even though he worked very long hours, he always went out of his way to spend time with her and make her feel very special. In fact, during the work week, it wasn't uncommon for her dad to come home over his lunch break just to give his daughter a big hug and so they could quickly eat together before he had to rush back to work. And so now, after hearing about her dad's amazing factory over countless lunches they spent together, Elaine, for the first time ever, was actually going to be able to see what he was talking about, because to this point, she had never even stepped foot inside of the factory. Finally, Elaine and her parents arrived in front of this big factory, and in the doors they went, and immediately Elaine is like totally struck by just how truly incredible this place is. I mean, it was huge inside. It was already packed with people who were chatting about. There were all these other coworkers and their kids and their families, and Christmas music was playing, and all she could smell was apple cider and baked goods. And she looked around and she saw the whole interior of this great entry room they had walked into was beautifully decorated for the holidays. There was tinsel and there were all these things hung up everywhere. And there was even fake snow all over the place to give it like a true Christmas vibe. And so Elaine, I mean, she had really high expectations of how grand this place was going to be. And so far, it had more than lived up to its expectations. I mean, this was really like an incredible thing. So she was delighted, and the whole night she just ran around the party holding her dad's hand, looking at the machines and meeting his coworkers and eating all these treats. I mean, it was really just an incredible time. I mean, the evening was a whirlwind for her, and before she knew it, Elaine was exhausted and back in the car, driving home, drifting off into a very happy sleep. The rest of Elaine's childhood was very charmed. I mean, basically, she and her dad stayed very close. You know, they went to that Christmas party every year after that first time she went, and it was always such a fun event. And Elaine and her dad continued to have those lunch breaks during the work week. And, by the time Elaine was getting old enough to start thinking about, starting a family of her own, she thought hard about the values that her father had instilled in her. One was her dad clearly worked very, very hard. And the second one was her father clearly prioritized family over everything else. As inconvenient as it was for him to come home on his lunch break practically every day, taking a break from, backbreaking work in the factory, he still did it because he wanted his daughter to feel prioritized and special. And so she knew when she had a family of her own, she would act like her father. So you can imagine how Elaine felt in 1983 when Elaine was 25 years old, and by this point she'd gotten married, she had two kids of her own, she was living up to the example her father had set for her. You can imagine how she felt when that year her father passed away. I mean, for Elaine, this was like earth-shattering. I mean, she knew he was getting older and it wasn't wholly unexpected that he passed, but for Elaine, I mean, this truly was like devastating. I mean, her father was like her rock. She had really modeled her whole life on her dad. However, after that initial really intense grief period ended right after the death of her father, Elaine was able to, have a moment of reflection, and she realized that, as devastating as it was that he was gone now, in a way, because of the way she had built her life, prioritizing family and, living like her dad, that in some ways, even though he was gone physically, spiritually, he was very much still with her and always would be. Fast forward 41 years to one afternoon late in the summer of 2024. And Elaine, who was now in her late 60s, was sitting at her kitchen table in her Norfolk home reading the newspaper. So Elaine had retired just a few years ago. And so now her life was pretty much exclusively about her family and about, slowing down and truly being retired. And in some ways, the timing couldn't have been better for her to start slowing down because Lately, Elaine had been feeling absolutely exhausted, which was odd because Elaine felt like, even though she viewed her retirement as a chance to slow down, that she would likely have more energy because she wasn't working anymore. And so her slowing down would sort of be by choice, not because she literally couldn't keep up anymore. But lately, it was like Elaine had zero energy. It's like all she could do was sit in place and either read or call her kids. And that was basically it. But on this particular day, as Elaine just sat in the kitchen reading the newspaper, despite not physically really doing much at all, she suddenly started to feel winded, like she had been running around or something, like it was hard to catch her breath, and it scared her. She put the paper down and she sat there for a minute trying to calm herself down, telling herself this is just like a panic attack or something, but it didn't go away and she really was struggling to breathe. And so she decided she would get up and go get a cup of water and just, take a sip of water and calm down. But when she stood up and began walking over to the sink to get water, like this sensation she was having just got worse and worse. And by the time she was at the counter, she's like holding on to it just to stay up on her feet. And she's trying to sip the water, but she's still like unable to breathe. And she realized that this, combined with this, recent really intense fatigue, meant something had to be wrong here. Like this was not something she could just write off. And so she hobbled her way over to the phone, she picked it up, and she called her doctor. Not long after, one of Elaine's children came by, picked her up, and drove her to the hospital. And by this point, Elaine, she'd calmed down a little bit, but still that experience of really not being able to breathe really had shaken her up. And so Elaine, she goes into the doctor's office and she sits down in the exam room and she explains to her doctor what's been going on and what just happened that day. And not long after that, her doctor got a series of tests done, and eventually Elaine got an answer from those tests that explained all of her symptoms. However, that answer made Elaine look at her childhood, her charmed childhood, in a completely new and disturbing way. It would turn out, decades earlier, Elaine's father really had been setting a great example by working very hard and always prioritizing his family and always prioritizing his daughter. But what her father didn't know at the time, in fact, many people didn't know at the time, was that his work itself was actually putting his family at risk. At this time in the UK, most factories, like the one Elaine's father worked at, made products that contained asbestos. So, asbestos is a substance that was used very widely for decades to construct structures primarily. Like in construction, it was used a lot. In fact, it was so common that basically any house or building built before the year 2000 likely was made with asbestos inside of it. And so when Elaine was growing up in the 1960s, asbestos was, naturally still being used all the time, and her father obviously encountered it daily at his work. But even though they didn't know it at the time, this was a huge problem for Elaine and her family, and really for anybody else who was living a life that was similar to theirs, because asbestos was eventually found to be highly toxic and known to cause a very specific type of very aggressive and very deadly cancer that can sometimes take decades to develop. It was the very kind of cancer that Elaine's father had died from in the 1980s. And unfortunately, it was the very kind of cancer that Elaine was diagnosed with in 2024 following that, difficulty breathing and fatigue spell. And then she would eventually die a year later in 2025 from that cancer. And so, in a tragic twist of fate here, basically it was because of how close Elaine was with her father growing up that she ultimately contracted the same disease that he did. I mean, there's no question he got that cancer because of his exposure to asbestos in the factory, but he would come home from the factory, like over lunch. He'd come home and he'd have lunch with Elaine and he wouldn't change. He'd give her a big hug. They'd have their lunch break together. He's putting asbestos on his daughter, not knowingly, but he's covering her in this toxic substance. And then when he would bring her to the Christmas party, all that white snow on the ground was not snow, it was asbestos, but they didn't know it was toxic. And so ultimately, it really was because of how much she loved her dad and how much he loved her that ultimately killed them both. Around 9 p.m. on January 18th, 2015, a 68-year-old man named Dennis Antiporak stood at his kitchen counter in North Miami Beach, Florida, writing a note. And this note was for his wife and for his adult daughter, Laura, who lived with them. And all he was doing was letting them know that he was going to be stepping out, but he'd be back in a couple of hours. Now, for Dennis, it actually was not that unusual for him to go out this late at night. This was kind of routine. He would often leave the condo where they lived, and he would go down the street to this diner called Denny's, which is a big chain in America. And he would hang out there with his friends, stay there for a couple of hours, and then he'd come back home. And tonight was going to be no different. His plan, as he said in this letter, was to go to Denny's. However, there was one stop he wanted to make before he headed out to Denny's, and he made that clear in his note. He basically provided his loved ones with his evening itinerary. So after finishing the note, Dennis left it on the counter, he grabbed his things, and then he walked out the front door of the condo. Several hours later, around 2 a.m., Dennis's daughter, Laura, paced around the living room of the family's condo with her cell phone to her ear. So she and her mother had gotten home around 10, so an hour after Dennis had left, and they had found Dennis's note on the kitchen island. But now, it was getting really late, and from the note, it seemed an awful lot like he would have been back by now. And so now Laura was trying to call her dad to figure out what was going on. However, every time Laura dialed her dad's number, it just went straight to voicemail. And so again, now that it's like 2 a.m. and she's starting to worry about her dad, she knew that he had gone to Denny's, the diner down the road, and so she looked up the number for that restaurant. It was open 24/7, and she called the Denny's. However, when a worker at Denny's answered the phone and Laura asked them, hey, is my dad there? Because by this point they would know him. He went there all the time. The worker said no. He hadn't been in at all the whole night. And so after hearing this, Laura was baffled. Like, where else could her dad be? But then she remembered the note, because her dad said before he was going to go to Denny's, he was going to make a pit stop. And so she looked at the note again and she was like, that's where he has to be. He's got to be upstairs. So upstairs in this condo complex was a whole bunch of amenities that this place offered for its residents. There was a big gym and a pool, and there were common areas and relaxation rooms and all these different things up there. And Dennis loved going up there. And in his note, he indicated that's where he was going to go and go relax for a little bit before going out to Denny's. And so Laura, she heads upstairs, and the first place she looks is the gym. But the gym was totally empty. No one's up there working out at 2 in the morning. It was vacant, and her dad's nowhere to be found. And then from the gym, she went to the pool area, and the pool was closed, but she could look into the pool area itself, and there was no one in there, including her dad. He was not in the pool. But then Laura looked from the pool over to this door that was near the pool area that led to one of those relaxation rooms that this condo offered its residents. And in her dad's note, he had indicated he was going up there to, relax. And so she walked over to the door, she tried the handle, it was unlocked, she pushed it open, and immediately she was hit with this overwhelming smell. She nearly gagged, and then she looked up and she saw her dad. So this condo had a whole bunch of different ways for their residents to unwind and relax. They had these relaxation rooms. They had mindfulness rooms and meditation rooms and yoga rooms. They had the pool, they had the gym, and they had Dennis's favorite relaxation room, which was actually just a sauna. So earlier that night, Dennis went into the sauna, expecting to be in there for a short amount of time to just relax, basically. A sauna, all it is just a closed space that gets really, really hot inside, and you sweat, and you just kind of sit there and just allow your body to kind of melt a little bit and relax, and then you get out again, you feel very refreshed. But it's critical that you only stay in for a limited amount of time because you're effectively inside of an oven. And Dennis, he went into the sauna. No one else is in there. He set the timer for when it should shut off, and he fell asleep inside the sauna. And then the timer malfunctioned. And so the sauna didn't turn off. And so he's asleep in the sauna. It's just cooking him over and over again until he actually has a heat-induced heart attack and he dies. But then nobody knew he was in there. And the sauna's still on. And so he's dead in the sauna, basically just cooking for hours and hours and hours until finally his daughter Laura went up there, opened up the sauna door, and found her dad, who by this point was literally charbroiled. On February 12, 1999, 42 Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend Silvina Peloso, who was 16 years old, boarded a plane in Eureka, California. After a quick 1-hour-long flight, they landed in San Francisco and then got their bags from baggage claim and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. After Carol signed some rental agreement paperwork with the person at the front desk, they were given car keys, and then the three women walked out of the airport into the parking lot where they saw their car. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After the women had put their luggage in the trunk, they all climbed inside, and then Carol began driving east towards the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Julie was competing in a cheerleading competition the following day at that university, and Julie was considering going to this school after she graduated high school, and so this cheerleading competition was a great excuse for her and her mom to check out the campus, and since Sylvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, she just tagged along for the trip. After an hour-and-a-half long drive, the trio arrived in Stockton, California, and they checked into a hotel, and then the next day, which was the 13th, Julie competed in this cheerleading competition, and then afterwards, her mom, and Sylvina spent the rest of the day checking out the campus and the surrounding town. Early the next morning, which was the 14th, the women checked out of their hotel and then drove 3 hours southeast to the sprawling motel complex called Cedar Lodge that was located just outside of Yosemite National Park's western entrance. Their plan was to spend a couple of days sightseeing inside of Yosemite before heading back to the San Francisco airport, where they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jens, and then the four of them would continue their journey and fly to Arizona, where they would explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka, California. So midday on the 14th, these three women arrive at the Cedar Lodge, and the lot would have been nearly empty because it was the wintertime and not that many people were visiting the park at that time. So they pull into the lot, they park their car, they go into the front desk where they checked in and they got their keys, and then they left the office and walked along the row of first floor rooms all the way to the very corner of the building to room 509, which was their room. Carol used her key, she opened the door, they went inside and dropped their luggage, and then they decided that they were just too tired to actually go in the park and go sightseeing that day. So instead, they kind of had a low-key afternoon and evening, mostly in their hotel room. The next morning, which was the 15th, the women got up early, they hopped in their red rental car, and they drove to the western entrance of Yosemite. They went inside, they parked their car, and they have this wonderful day looking at these astonishing cliff sides and snow-covered mountains and these huge sequoia trees and these beautiful meadows that stretched out in front of them. And then towards the end of the day, Julie and Sylvina actually went ice skating on a frozen pond. So it was just this totally magical day at the park. And then finally, as the sun was starting to go down, the trio finally left the park, got in their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. There, they ate dinner at the lodge's 1950s style diner. They ate hamburgers, and then afterwards, they swung by the front desk and rented some VHS movie tapes that they brought back to their room. Once they were inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas and then sat on the bed and watched one of their movies. And then when it was over, they brushed their teeth and then they got in bed, turned out the light, and tried to go to sleep. But a few minutes after their lights were out, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, which was the 16th, Jens, Carol's husband and Julie's father, was anxiously waiting at the San Francisco airport for his wife and his daughter's friend. And he's looking at his watch and he knows they don't have that much time before their flight is going to take off. And he's just hoping they're going to come running around a corner and they're going to barely make this flight. But they don't. And finally, Jens, who does not have a cell phone, and neither does Carol, he decides there must have been some sort of miscommunication and that Carol and the girls must have flown on ahead. And so he decides at the last minute to just board the flight himself and fly to Arizona and hopes his family will be there. But when he touches down in Arizona, his family is not there. And so he rushed to the hotel hoping that maybe they were there. They weren't. He spoke to the hotel's front desk and said, hey, has my wife Carol contacted you? And they said, no, she hasn't contacted us and we have no record of her being here. And so Jens is obviously very upset. He's very worried, and he spends the rest of the day calling around to friends and family and acquaintances and anybody who might know where Carol and the girls are. But nobody has heard from them and nobody knows where they are. And so that night, as Jens is about to go to bed, he convinces himself that they are probably just fine. This is just some screw up. Carol is an unbelievably fierce woman. She's incredibly competent. She will take care of those girls, and I'm sure I will see them tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning and Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or reached out to him in any way, and there was just no sign of her or the girls, Jens finally contacted police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens, the first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge, which is the last place they knew Carol, Julie, and Sylvina had been. The manager of the lodge would tell police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But Carol had checked out in advance, so the manager would not have seen her anyways. She would not have had to go by the front desk on the way out. So that was not an anomaly. The manager also told police that on the 16th, after the three women should have been out of their room, the cleaners went by room 509, and when they went inside, it was vacant and nothing seemed amiss. It was relatively clean, minus some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk as they should be. It just looked like the women had left. And so the police reached out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport to see if Carol had made it to the airport and dropped off her car. But when they spoke to the manager of this rental company, they would say, no, Carol has not dropped off her car, and she hasn't called about extending her lease, which is now overdue. Based on the information the police gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, they began operating on the theory that the three women left their lodge motel room on the 16th and then either got into a car accident somewhere and had just not been found yet, or they had driven somewhere, gotten out of their car and gotten lost, perhaps inside of Yosemite National Park or some other trail somewhere, or they had fallen victim to some crime. But at this point, the police were not taking seriously the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as around the western entrance of Yosemite, but absolutely nothing was found. A number of workers from Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police and subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Also, a number of friends and family of the three women were also interviewed by police and cleared as well. Then, a few days after this search has started, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards inside of it, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California, which was a suburb that was located about 2 hours west of Cedar Lodge. Some high school students saw it on the ground and gave it to a police officer. There was no reason for Carol and the girls to be in Modesto, California, and so this signaled to police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And so if that was the case, then almost certainly these three women had fallen victim to some sort of crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued to search the roads and trails in and around Cedar Lodge and the western entrance to Yosemite, and they looked all over Modesto. But besides this wallet being found, there were no further developments with the case. Then on March 18th, which is about a month after the three women originally went missing, a hiker was way off in the middle of this forest about 2 hours north of Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto, California, when he turned onto this logging road that nobody really ever went down. And as he's walking down this road, he sees up ahead the skeleton of a car. It looks like a car had been set on fire. And so he calls it into police, not really knowing what he's looking at. The police come out and they're able to identify this car. This shell of a car is the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. When they searched the car, the inside, the main cabin of the car, there really was nothing left. There looked to be some remnants of some suitcases and maybe some clothing, but mostly it was just the frame of the car and some springs. But when they opened the trunk of the car, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies with their hands still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, they were able to confirm the bodies belonged to Carol and Sylvina. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie, the 15-year-old. She was not in the car, around the car, or in the surrounding areas. And so there was this glimmer of hope that maybe if law enforcement acts fast enough, they can find Julie and save her before it's too late. But all hope was lost when just a couple of days into this search around the car, when they still hadn't found anything, the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. And on this letter was this crude map that showed this very specific spot overlooking a lake. It was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the car was. And then on this note as well was a phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using this crude map, the police went to Don Pedro Lake. They went up to the overlook as marked on this map, and there they looked down and they saw the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie. At this point, police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California, that they believed were connected in some way to what happened to these three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest to the police. They were half-brothers Eugene Dykes and Michael Larwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer and for several drug charges and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks, basically insinuating that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to these three women. And then after Carol, Sylvina, and Julie's bodies had been found, the synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol matched the synthetic fibers that were pulled off of Michael and Eugene on their clothing and from their vehicle when they were arrested. And so the police were very confident that they had their killers and they had them behind bars already. But they still needed to compile evidence before they could formally charge them and make their names public to the media. And so when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began panicking about a killer or killers on the loose, the police came out and said, everybody calm down, we have the people responsible, we just can't tell you who they are yet, you need to be patient, we're building the case, but everybody's safe, there's nothing to worry about. But 4 months went by and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders, but they continued to assure the public that they had their killers behind bars, and so nobody has anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the three bodies, Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 24-hour shift in the clinic, and he had just gotten back to his cabin, which was inside of Yosemite, when his pager went off. And so he went to a phone, he dialed the number that was on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up and said, hey, Dr. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person? And Dr. Kidd said, sure, I'd love to help. And then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one. And then before he could clarify, he hung up the phone. And so Dr. Kidd is really confused what he meant about these implications, because in the past 3 years he had worked at this park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people in the park, but they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always because the person got lost or fell or something, which was fairly common inside of the park. And so as soon as this convoy of other Yosemite staff members that are part of the search rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside, he hopped in one of the vehicles, and he asked the driver, what's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with regards to this missing person? And the driver would explain to him that, hey, 4 months earlier, we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina, and they were found murdered outside of Yosemite. And while the police have said they have their killers behind bars, the police still have not come out and actually named who their killers are or charged anyone in their murders. And so that's made many of us think that maybe they don't have the killer or killers behind bars. Maybe there's a killer or killers still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight, we have another person who's gone missing inside of the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led many of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight. Dr. Kidd was totally shocked at this news, but he was even more shocked when he discovered who it was that was missing. It was somebody he knew. Her name was Joey Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide that knows everything about the park. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy of Yosemite staff that were going to be a part of the search sped around the corner and went down this unmarked road with huge trees on either side, and then eventually they came out of this heavily forested road and they entered into this unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end across this huge meadow is this one green cabin sitting at the base of this mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joey was living. As Dr. Kidd and the convoy went across this meadow and got closer to this cabin, Dr. Kidd could see park rangers walking around the perimeter of the cabin, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Dr. Kidd and his vehicle came to a stop right outside of the marked off area, they got out and they could see parked right next to the cabin was this white pickup truck. It was Joey's pickup truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage, and it looked like there was luggage that had spilled out onto the ground and some of the doors were still open. And so it gave Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers the impression that Joey must have either been loading things into her truck or unloading things out of her truck at the time she went missing. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers kind of huddled up with the park rangers, and the rangers explained that Joey's friends that were living in San Francisco were expecting Joey to arrive at their house the day before, but when she didn't and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called it in, and that's why they were there looking for her. And so after talking about the circumstances of the case, they all decided they would break into 5 different search groups, and they would begin searching the immediate area. Dr. Kidd and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin towards the tree line, and then once they got into that forest, they started walking towards this creek. And as they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and saplings, and it looked like someone had come running through there, and perhaps the person who was running was Joey. And so they begin following these tracks that go right alongside this creek, and then at some point, one of the searchers yells out, "Hey, what's that up there?" And about 10 feet ahead of them, where the ground kind of sloped down into a ditch out of view, right before the ditch, hanging on a little tree on the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. And so Dr. Kidd, who was at the front of his small search party, he began walking towards these keys, and as he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into this ditch right on the other side of these keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom, he immediately began to gag, and he turned around and quickly walked away. The other 4 searchers, they walked up and they had a look down, and they too had a similar reaction. And before long, the group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police, and the police sent a police officer to Joey Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and they need her to call them. And then he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joey's mother was immediately concerned and confused and tried to get more information from this officer, but the officer just said, "Look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything." And so eventually she thanked him, she shut the door, and she went into the kitchen and she dials this number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joey's mother, and at that point, the person who picked up quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior, and this person asked Joey's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" So Joey's mother says, "No, I was not aware of that." And then this person very delicately says, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joey's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her? Because she's got bright red hair. Can you make sure it's really her?" And the person on the other side of the line hesitated for a minute and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." And so after this call finally ended, Joey's mother was confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? That seems like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? And so she was horribly distraught. She didn't know what else to do. She was told to just kind of wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. And so she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to actually get out there and see what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. And so she has this very restless night's sleep where she's just praying that this person was not actually her daughter. And then the next morning she gets up, she rushes to the airport, and as she's waiting to board her plane, she grabs a newspaper from a nearby kiosk, and the headline reads, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite." And that's when she understood why that person could not tell her whether or not this was her daughter based on hair color. It's because this body did not have a head. But from the time she got that phone call to this headline running in the paper, these searchers had found the head. It was located 27 feet away under some brush, and they were able to confirm that it was the body of Joey Armstrong. Joey's death was immediately treated like a homicide, and right away, the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joey's murder is connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina from 4 months earlier, even though the police were still saying, "We have our killers behind bars for those murders. Joey's murder is completely unconnected." Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right about this, because there was a break in Joey's case almost immediately. On the night that Joey went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin, and they noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout, and as it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in Yosemite Valley. And so within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite and was pulled off the side of this highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up. There was no one inside of this vehicle, but then down this embankment off the highway led down to this forest where there was a river kind of out of sight that people like to swim and fish in. And so these 2 officers decide to head down and see if maybe the driver is down there. So they make their way down, and sure enough, they come in contact with the driver. He was laying on this rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. And so the 2 officers, they come up to him and announce themselves. And this very well-built, good-looking guy stands up and he calmly covers himself, and he takes the marijuana out of his mouth and he says, "Hey, what can I do for you guys?" And so over the course of their conversation, the police would learn this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman graffiti man at Cedar Lodge Motel. He would tell police that he was not anywhere near Joey's cabin on the night she went missing, and the police ultimately bought it and said, okay, they confiscated his marijuana, and then they walked back up the hill, leaving him down there, and they took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators that had been called in for this case, they analyzed those pictures those officers had taken of the tires of Carrie's car, and they compared them to pictures of the tire tracks at Joey's cabin, and they determined they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Carrie down again. This time he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots. It was a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering Joey Armstrong, and he was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was booked, Carey dropped a bombshell. He confessed to not only murdering Joey Armstrong, but also he confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso, the friend of Julie Sund. And he did all of this on his own. He had no other accomplices, which means the police never had the killer or killers behind bars. It would turn out Eugene Dykes, who was one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about he and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold blanket, and so they did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many people who lived in that area and like some people in the media had speculated. Carey would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession of how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On February 14th, 1999, so the day that Carol, Julie, and Silvina arrived at Cedar Lodge, Carey was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Carey, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Carey walked up her front walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind that he was going to act on a fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. And so his plan that night was he would go inside and he would not only kill his girlfriend, but he would also kill her 2 daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out this plan, he noticed out one of their windows there was a man in their backyard. And he asked his girlfriend, "Who's that guy out there?" And she would say, "Oh, I hired someone to take care of our property. So he's going to be cutting the grass and, doing some things with our garden. He's going to be here for a little bit, but he'll stay outside." And so this totally screwed up Carey's plan because he was not expecting there to be anybody there that night. And so for several hours, Carey anxiously sat there constantly looking out the window, waiting for this guy to leave so he could kill these 3 people. But the worker was just taking a lot of time, and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. And so finally, Carey left without any explanation. Angry and frustrated, he began driving back to Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. And when he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed there was a car he had not seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carey had this urge to find out who owned that car. And maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned that car, and she was potentially alone. And if that was the case, he could fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. And so Carey parked his car a little bit away from this red car, and he walked over to the room that was right in front of this red car. And it was room 509, and he peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up, and he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside of this room. It was Carol, Julie, and Silvina. And so Carey stayed back and continued looking through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside of this room. And after a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom and nobody coming into the room but these 3 women and no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. And so when Carey finally turned around and left to go back to his room, he made the decision that he was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, which was February 15th, Carey secretly followed the 3 women when they hopped in their rental and drove to Yosemite. He followed them to the parking lot, and then he waited in the parking lot until the women had finished going through the park and having this wonderful time. He trailed them from the parking lot back to the Cedar Lodge, and then he secretly followed them when they went to that diner and they had hamburgers for dinner. And he continued to follow them from a distance and watch them rent movies from the front desk. And he followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside the room and he watched them long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his room and he got his toolbox. In his toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. And then around 11 p.m., he left his apartment and went downstairs and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. And he looked in the window and it was totally dark inside, so he assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door and very cautiously opened it up just a crack, leaving that chain link lock still attached. And so she looked through at Carrie and said, "Hi, can I help you?" And Carrie, who held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that said he was the Cedar Lodge handyman, he said, "Hi, ma'am, sorry to disturb you so late, but there is a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. So can I come in and just have a quick look, and then I'll be out of here?" And Carol apparently was just not buying it, and she said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one, but even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow, because we're all trying to sleep." But Carrie was very persistent, and Carrie was known to be very charming and very disarming, and eventually he talked his way into the room. And so he walks inside, he walks past the bed where the other two teen girls are still sleeping, he goes into the bathroom, and for a few minutes he kind of pretends to fiddle around inside of the bathroom while Carol is standing right outside looking in at him. And then at some point, Carrie reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and he aimed it at Carol, and he said, "Stay calm, I'm not gonna hurt you, this is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed their best chance at getting out of this situation was just to comply and do what he says. He'll rob us and then he'll leave and we'll be okay. And so Carol very dutifully went back into the room and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend. And before long, Carrie had tied up all three of them. He put the two teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he put Carol on the bed. And then he proceeded to assault Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. And then after she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. And then after he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room. He went to the bathroom, he opened it up, he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying, and pulled her out, and he left Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed, where he assaulted her before strangling her as well to death with some additional rope. And then after Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel and put her in the trunk of the rental car along with Carol's body. And then after that, he went back inside the motel room, and then once again, he opened up the bathroom door, he grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But then afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. And while she was in there wondering what's going to happen to her, what happened to her mom, what happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room and tidy it up, and he moved all of their luggage out of their room and put it into the rental car. And then after he was satisfied, he went back inside the motel room, he opened up the bathroom door, he pulled Julie out and had her stand right outside the bathroom, and then Carrie proceeded to clean up the bathroom but left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women had left in a bit of a hurry. And so after that, he grabbed Julie and he walked her out to the car and he sat her down in the front seat. She only had a blanket on at this point. Everything else had been taken off of her. And then Carrie hopped in the front seat and he began driving off. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She has no idea where her mom is. She has no idea where her friend is. She has no idea they're actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. And the man that had just assaulted her for hours is now driving her into the darkness. She has no idea where she's going, and all she's got is this blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal what's happening to this poor girl. And so for 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night, and the whole time he's trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she's going to be okay and that her mom and her friend, they're going to be okay. And then finally he pulls off the highway down some switchbacks into this big parking lot of the Don Pedro Lake. And then once he parks the car, there's no other cars around. It's still dark out. The sun hasn't come up. He gets out and he tells Julie to get out of the car. But Julie is so scared, she can't move. So she can't even get out of the car. And so Carrie gets out. He walks around to her side. He opens the door and he scoops her up like you might hold a baby. And he walked with her up the trail all the way to this overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. And once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and he laid it down, and then he proceeded to assault her again. And then as the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover cover his tracks. And so Carrie stops what he's doing. He stands up, he reaches down and pulls Julie up to her feet. And so she's standing with her back to the lake. And as he's looking at her, he says, "I love you." And then he pulls out his knife and begins hacking her throat. And then he pushes her down the hillside where she tumbles and finally comes to a stop underneath some bushes where she dies. Carrie grabbed the blanket on the ground and he walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was nobody out there, so he hopped inside. He drove out of the lot and drove 1 hour north until he was well into this forest, and he pulled down a logging road where he abandoned this car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, California, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of the road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's body were found in the back of the burned out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to police that had the map of where Julie's body was and that horrible message of "we had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to police in order to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there really was more than one person perpetrating these murders, hence the "we had fun with this one." Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carrie along with the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. And that was because, one, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing violence against these 3 women. And two, probably most importantly, the police discovered when Carrie was a child, his younger brother was kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. And although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carrie. And so the police figured there's no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knows how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carrie seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save these 3 women from being abducted or from being harmed. In July of that year, so 4 months after the 3 women's bodies were discovered, Carrie, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, he was just driving around Yosemite kind of reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out this fantasy and not get punished for it, when he noticed there was this woman way off in the distance walking in and out of this cabin that was fairly isolated. And so he drove his 1979 International Scout blue SUV down this forested road, and he reaches this meadow and he looks across this meadow, and now that this woman is even closer, he can tell she's clearly loading things into her truck, and she's going back and forth, and he's watching, wondering if there's anybody else helping her, because this cabin is very secluded, and he's thinking, if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. And so after a while, when he only sees her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decides he's gonna go kill her. And so he drives across the meadow and he pulls up right next to her truck, and he gets out and he introduces himself. And the woman is so completely caught off guard by this random strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly, that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she says, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" And Carrie would proceed to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. And then at some point, Carrie drew a pistol and he aimed it at her and said, "Go inside your cabin." And so Joey put her hands up and she went inside the cabin like she was told, and Carrie followed her inside, and then he bound her wrists and he bound her mouth with duct tape, and then he ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. And then once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carrie got in the driver's seat and he began leaving the cabin, headed back out away towards that road he came in on. And as he's bombing across the meadow, Joey leaps head first out of the window of this moving car and smashes onto the ground, and she immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carrie jams on the brakes, he hops out and he starts chasing after Joey, but Joey manages to get fairly close to that tree line right behind the cabin before Carrie ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. And then Joey is viciously trying to fight Carrie off of her, and Carrie, kind of in a panic, draws his knife and he tries to slash at Joey, but Joey tucks her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. And so frustrated, Carrie just stands up and he grabs Joey by the hair and he begins hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. And the whole time Joey's doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just can't. And finally they get inside the woods and Carrie drags her into this ditch, and once she's down at the bottom, he puts his foot on the top of her head and forces it back, forcibly exposing her throat. and then at that point he pulls out his knife and he begins to cut. Afterwards, Carey considered keeping Joey's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carey attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as is, he left her cabin as is. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to Cedar Lodge. Carey would tell police that as soon as he killed Joey Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her 2 young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out the attack. Carey Stainer, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera that was found intact near the burned out car in the woods. The police would develop the pictures on this camera in hopes there would be some clue as to who murdered them. But it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Carey confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images of the camera roll, we know Carey Stainer was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on this camera was taken by Julie of her mother sitting on the bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they're getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Carey knocked on their door. 24-year-old Gina Allen and her brand new boyfriend, 28-year-old Brandon Day, could not believe their luck. For the past 48 hours, they had been stranded in the rugged wilderness of the San Jacinto mountain range in California when they looked down into this ravine and they saw a campsite. There was a tarp that had been strung up between 2 trees. And so they ran over to it hoping that the owner of this campsite would be in there and they could help them get out of these mountains. But when they got to the campsite, there wasn't anyone there. But from the looks of it, it looked like someone had been living in this site fairly recently. Underneath this makeshift roof from this tarp was a sleeping pad, there was a warm sweater, there was shoes, there was a disposable razor, some kitchen utensils, and there was a yellow backpack. Without any hesitation, Brandon and Gina, who were totally famished and they're exhausted and they're desperate, they just start rifling through the different things in camp, hoping to find some things that will help save their life, like a cell phone or a radio, or even just a lighter or some matches or some food. And so Brandon focused on all the items that are just kind of laying out under the tarp, and Gina focused on the contents of the yellow backpack. And so Gina, she opens up this backpack and she starts pulling out all these maps that are inside. And she notices on the margins of these maps in the white space, there is handwriting, and it's done in pen, and it looks like it's been written fairly recently. Now, at first, she didn't read any of the notes that were on these margins. She was just kind of pulling them out and stacking them on the ground next to her and continuing to rummage through this bag. But at some point, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed on the top map that was sitting on the ground next to her, there was a particular note at the top of the page that as soon as she saw it, she stopped what she was doing, she turned and looked at it. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in fact, she didn't want to get her hopes up, but she slowly reached over, she picked the map up, and she put it right in front of her face, and as soon as she was reading it, she just started laughing. She was so happy, she was so relieved, she yelled to Brandon to come over and look at this. And so Brandon stopped what he was doing, he turned around, and he bent down, and he looked exactly where she was looking, and when he read what she had read, he started laughing too. They were saved. There at the top of this map, there was a note that was dated the same date as the day they were there, May 8th. And so they knew whoever had written it at least in the last couple of hours because it was May 8th. And so they had to be around here somewhere. And so Gina and Brandon, they stand up and they start yelling out for the owner of this camp to please come out and help them. But in their excitement, Brandon and Gina had overlooked a critical detail in this note. And it would turn out that critical detail would change their lives and the life of the man who owned this camp forever. Before Brandon and Gina ever began their doomed hike into the San Jacinto mountain range, another man, one which neither of them knew, was gearing up for a hike of his own that would take him through the San Jacinto mountain range. His name was John Donovan, and on April 19th, 2005, which was the day he would begin this journey, he was 59 years old. John had absolutely no family. He was born an only child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had been orphaned and basically had to raise himself from that point onward. By the time John was in his 20s, he had moved to Virginia, where he had taken a job as a social worker. And despite making a fairly decent salary, he refused to spend any more money than he absolutely had to. It was a habit he had developed as an orphan child, trying to make ends meet with virtually no money whatsoever, and as an adult, that habit just never left him. So as a result, for his entire life, all the way up until he left for that hike in 2005, he never had anything nice. He basically wore the exact same outfit virtually every single day. He never owned a car, he never owned a phone, he never owned a computer, and when it came to where he chose to live, he would always live in the most absurdly cheap dwellings possible, which included at one point living in a partially burned down, abandoned savings bank with no heat. John was a proud Irish Catholic, he drank lots of whiskey, he swore like a sailor, and he had no problem speaking his mind no matter who he was talking to. While he was a lovely person once you got to meet him, his unorthodox lifestyle and his at times gruff exterior made it pretty difficult for him to make friends for most of his life. But when he was in his 40s, he wanted to lose some weight, and so he decided to join a hiking club. And to his surprise, the other members of this hiking club adored him. They thought he was hysterical, and he made being out on the trail so much more fun and enjoyable. And before long, all these members of this club became John's family that he never had. And so John would go on every single trip this hiking club went on, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him in his life. When it came to hiking, though, John was a bit of an anomaly. Even though he would hike sometimes over 4,000 miles in any given year, he would still routinely get lost on trails he had been on dozens and dozens of times. But despite being totally self-aware of this fatal flaw in his hiking abilities, John rarely did anything to compensate for it. For example, he didn't bring with him on most hikes a compass, which would be the first thing you would think to bring with you to stay oriented. Also, because he refused to buy a phone, he didn't have that to aid him either if he ever got lost. In fact, John rarely brought much of anything on any hike he went on, because John is what you would call a ultralight backpacker, which basically meant you would only pack the absolute bare essentials, and in John's case, sometimes less than the absolute bare essentials. And despite his friends trying repeatedly to get him to pack more equipment so he was more prepared, he would always say, no, he knows what he's doing and everything is good. And the truth is, John always did manage to get from point A to point B on all of his hikes, some of which included extremely difficult hikes, like the time he hiked the 500-mile-long Colorado Trail, or the time he hiked the 2,175-mile-long Appalachian Trail. Now, John would tell you that was all skill, but his friends would say, John was extremely lucky. He would get lost, and then at the last second he would find the trail again, or he would lose some piece of critical equipment, and then just someone on the trail would happen to walk by that had an extra set of whatever it was that John needed. And then one time when John was in Poland on a hike, he slipped on this icy embankment where earlier that day, 2 other hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides. He's flailing. He can't stop himself. And then the drawstring on his pants gets caught up in a tree, and that arrests his fall and it saves his life. And so from that point on, John would only wear those pants when he went hiking, and he called them his lucky pants. In the spring of 2005, John and one of his very close hiking friends named Ken Baker, who was roughly his age, decided they were going to hike the 2,650-mile-long Pacific Crest Trail. This trail spanned the entire west coast of the United States. It starts in Southern California, right on the border of Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington State, right on the border of Canada. It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. he had actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, "I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not." And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker. His coworkers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California all alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Paget, and asked him, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto mountain range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter. And statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto mountain range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain, it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto mountain range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto mountain range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to your death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near 2 other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm. It was a 46-year-old nurse from Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge, but was still several miles away, three very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, "Hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like?" And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of the storm, and we have all the right gear. I mean, you should really consider turning around and leaving." But these three hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the three men that had told him not to go eventually just said, "Okay, good luck." And they carried on down the trail and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them, and when he gets up close, he can see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, "You know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you." But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own and he would go up to Fuller Ridge and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats and allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge, and if John was going to continue like he said he would up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge, so best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge, but by that point, the snow was practically blinding. And so at this point, John decided, you know what? I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours, while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below, he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow, he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours, he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals. And finally, he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley, where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. If he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those. And his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in. And so he was boxed in, he was trapped, and he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night. The next morning, when the sun came up, John attempted to make a fire, but none of the wood he was finding was dry enough, so all of his fires just kind of smoldered but didn't really catch. He had a mirror, a signal mirror, and he was prepared to flag down any aircraft that flew overhead, but no aircraft did, so he didn't flag anyone down. And so by the end of that night, he was back under his tarp, having made no progress, settling in for another freezing cold, sleepless night. The next morning, when the sun finally came up again, John was totally disheartened, and he decided to start jotting notes down on the margins of his map, which was the only place he had space to write. He figured he would keep a sort of diary. That way, if he didn't get out of here, someone would figure out what happened to him. And so his first entry was that day, May 5th, and he wrote that his friend Ken was right. He should have postponed this trip by 3 weeks and avoided the bad weather. Ken was the smart one. And also in this May 5th entry, he took an inventory of his food supply. He said he only had 12 cheese crackers left. And then on May 8th, John wrote a note that said, "Took a fall, too weak to climb out of canyon, down is a gorge, no way out." This was the message that Gina and Brandon discovered when they stumbled on this campsite. But the significance of this note was not literally what he wrote, but rather when he wrote it. On May 6th, Brandon Day and his girlfriend, Gina Allen, were in Palm Springs for a business convention. Brandon was a financial advisor, and so he was out here for business, and Gina was his guest, so she was really just vacationing. And so towards the end of the convention, when Brandon had some free time, he and Gina decided to leave the hotel and go on a hike somewhere. And so they actually linked up with a tour group that was leaving the hotel, that was heading over to this tram station where they were going to take a tram car all the way up to the top of the San Jacinto mountain range. A tram car is basically like a ski lift, except once you ride it to the top of the mountain, you don't do any skiing, you just do sightseeing. And so Brandon and Gina, they get to this tram car, they hop inside, they get to the top, and it's totally amazing, beautiful view. There's snow at the top, and they're told they have about 20 or 30 minutes before their group is going to take the tram car back down again. And so Brandon and Gina decide to kind of venture off away from the main group and have some alone time before they leave again. And as they kind of venture off, they start to hear what sounds like a waterfall. And so the two of them are kind of looking around, asking if they can see it or if they know where it is, and they don't. And so they say, hey, do you want to just leave the trail and walk towards this waterfall? It can't be far. It sounds like it's only maybe a couple of minutes away. We'll take some pictures, we'll come back, and then we'll catch the tram back down again. And so they decide this is a great idea. They leave the path and they start walking towards the sound of this waterfall. But after walking for a pretty significant distance, they realize the sound of this waterfall is not getting any closer. It seems to actually just be getting farther and farther away. And what they didn't know was happening was the sound of the waterfall was actually echoing off the walls of this mountain. It was basically playing a trick on them. The acoustics made it seem like it was really close, but really it wasn't. It was pretty far away. And so by the time they finally did locate this waterfall, they knew they had ventured fairly far off the main trail, and they really needed to hustle to get back up to the tram station to meet their group and catch that last car out. And so they took a couple of pictures of this waterfall and then quickly turned around and began booking it back towards the station. But on their return trip, which they believed they were going in the right direction, they started hearing the sound of voices coming from the tram station, but they were coming from a different direction. And so Gina and Brandon stopped and they're thinking, I think we got to go this way, but clearly that's the sound of the other people in our group coming from that direction. And so they decide to follow the sound of the voices. But just like the sound of the waterfall, the sound of the voices were not coming from that direction. That was just an echo bouncing off the walls. It was basically a trick the mountain was playing on Brandon and Gina. So they start walking in the wrong direction, and after walking for quite a while and not getting anywhere nearer the tram station, the voices just finally stop. And they look at their watches and they realize they missed the cutoff. They missed the last tram. All those tourists they were with, they've left. They are now alone somewhere out in the middle of the mountains. But they did not panic. They figured, you know what, we'll just make our way to the tram station and we'll either catch the next tram or, maybe there's a payphone or something up there we can use and, we'll figure it out. Now, it's important to mention that Brandon and Gina did not expect to spend very much time out in the elements. They expected to get on a tram, stay at the top of this tram station with a bunch of other tourists where there was a restaurant and a bar, and then they were going to ride that tram car back down and be back at their hotel before dinner time. As such, they didn't bring any supplies. They didn't even have their cell phones. They had left those in the hotel room because they wanted to make sure they were focused on each other. And so all they had were the clothes on their back, which were very light. They had tank tops and some sweatpants on. They each had a very light jacket as well. And they had a wallet and some chapstick. They had no water. They had no food. And so Brandon and Gina, they begin walking around in search of this tram station. And for several hours, despite their best efforts, they don't find it. And then before long, the sun is going down and the temperature is dropping rapidly. And so eventually, after it becomes too dark to continue to move around, the couple winds up going into a cave where they huddle up all night, barely avoiding becoming hypothermic. The next day, when the sun comes up, they haven't slept at all, they climb out of their cave, and they continue walking around the mountain in hopes they find this tram station. But eventually, they get to one of the higher points of the area they were in, and they have a pretty good vantage point around them. And when they start looking out, they don't see the tram station. They don't see anything but wilderness in all directions. And so they decided their best bet was just to walk straight down the mountain and try to just walk off the mountain. And they figured as they began walking down the mountain that the tour guide had probably recognized they were short 2 people the day before. And so certainly a search had been launched and there were people looking for them, and probably they would be found long before they ever had to actually walk off this mountain. But little did they know, their tour guide that had brought them onto the tram and then brought that group down, they had recognized they were short 2 people, but they assumed those 2 people must have just taken an earlier tram, and so nothing was reported. nobody was looking for them. And so all day, Brandon and Gina made their way down this very steep mountain, falling half the time, smashing into rocks and trees, and getting cut up on manzanita bushes. It was just this awful experience. And by the time the sun was going down, they had no sense of how close they were to the bottom. They didn't have a good viewpoint. They were just kind of trapped inside of the wilderness. So once again, they huddled up for the entire night. This time they didn't have a cave to protect them from the wind. And so it was just another absolutely miserable night. And so finally the sun comes up on the third day, and Brandon and Gina, they're up and they are moving straight down this hill. They want to get out of there as soon as they can. And after smashing into more boulders and more trees and getting more banged up, they finally arrive at the same drop-off down into a ravine in Long Valley that John had gotten to. And so they're standing over this ravine, debating whether they should make the leap and jump down into this ravine, even though it means they can't climb out again. And so they're looking around, they're figuring, you know what, we don't really have a better choice. We don't really have the energy to climb all the way up and try to go a different way. And we don't even know if those ways are more advantageous. And so just like John, they turn around onto their stomachs, they grip the top of this drop-off, and then slip down into the ravine. Once they stand back up, they start walking down this ravine, and they spot a river. And they run over to the river, and they drink as much water as they possibly can, and it's a huge morale booster. And then they get back up again, and they're continuing walking down the stream, when off in the distance, they notice a green tarp strung up between trees. It was John's campsite. And so Brandon and Gina, they run over to this campsite, and they eventually come across John's notes on the margins of his maps. But after standing up and yelling out for this owner to please come out here and help us, we need your help, we're lost, and then no one came out of the woods, no one heard them, no one responded, Brandon went back to the note and he looked at it again, and that's when he noticed it. The note had been written on May 8th. However, it had been written on May 8th, 2005. The year that Brandon and Gina were reading it was 2006. So this note was 1 year old. John had just happened to get lost and write a note on the exact same calendar day that Gina and Brandon arrived at his campsite and discovered the note. In their initial excitement and joy that they might get saved, they did not pick up on that year discrepancy. The couple began looking more closely at all of the gear underneath the tarp, and they noticed all of the metal objects like the forks and spoons and the pots and the pans, they were all starting to rust, and some of the other objects like the shoes looked like they had been sitting in the same spot for a really long time. They both started to get a really bad feeling about this campsite, like something terrible had happened there. Gina emptied the yellow backpack's contents onto the ground, and that's when they found a wallet. They opened it up and they pulled out an ID card, and it was John Donovan's ID card. So now they knew who had written the note and who owned this camp. Afterwards, Gina and Brandon laid out all of the maps to see if there were other messages that they had not read yet. And there were. There were 2 other additional messages after the May 8th message. On May 11th, John said he was celebrating his 60th birthday and that unfortunately he was down to his last 2 cheese crackers. And then in his final message on May 14th, John wrote, "Headed down to creek for water. Goodbye. Love you all." Devastated, the couple knew what they were reading were almost certainly John's last words, and his body was most likely somewhere around here. And then it dawned on the couple that if John, who seemed like an experienced hiker who had all this gear, if he had gotten trapped and died out here, then how did they stand any chance with no experience and no equipment? And so not knowing what else to do, Gina just rounded up all of John's things, she stuffed them into his yellow backpack, and then she shouldered the pack, and then she and Brandon just walked away from John's campsite and continued walking downhill, hoping that up ahead there was not going to be some gorge like John had mentioned in his May 8th note. But unfortunately, after walking for a little while, they reached that cliff with the 100-foot drop, with the waterfall going off the side of it, and they realized that they were trapped, same as John. There was nothing they could do. And so totally speechless and shocked, they just both sat down, they didn't look at each other, and they just sat there wondering what was going to happen next. And they both were thinking, you know, this could be the place where I die. At some point, Gina kind of snapped out of her trance and she took John's backpack and she began rifling through it, pulling everything out all over again. And Brandon asked her, you know, what are you doing? And she said, well, you know, maybe there's something in here that we missed. Maybe there's a secret pocket or something in here that could help us. And so she rifles through this bag, and sure enough, she finds inside of a small pocket in the bottom of the bag was another bag, a little plastic bag, and inside of it were matches, and they were still dry. And so immediately the couple pull them out and they start to round up logs to try to make a fire. And as soon as they light it, it doesn't catch because all the logs in the area that were on the ground were wet from previous snowstorms and rainstorms. And so all night they tried lighting these fires, but they all just kind of smoldered out. And so eventually, after the sun went down, Gina and Brandon, who were totally disheartened, they went back up to John's campsite and they went under his tarp and they huddled together for another freezing cold night. The next morning, Brandon woke up because he actually did fall asleep, and Gina was still sleeping. And so Brandon decided to just leave the tarp and go out and get a breath of fresh air. He knew they were in a terrible position, but he just wanted to clear his head. So he stood up and he could barely stand. He was so achy and tired and he was so hungry, and he decided he would just walk down to the edge of this cliff and look out into the valley to see if maybe there was a way down. And so he walked along the river, stopping periodically to get a sip of water until he got to the very edge. And when he got there, he looked down and he saw something that he had not seen the day before. There, in a pool of water all the way down, 100 feet down, was a body lying face down in a pool of water. And that body belonged to John Donovan. Brandon was too far away to actually confirm if that really was John, but he instantly knew. But instead of being scared or saddened or depressed by the sight, it kind of invigorated Brandon and reminded him that if he doesn't act, he and Gina were going to die too. And so Brandon decided he wasn't going to set some small campfire to try to signal someone. He was going to try to light the entire forest on fire. And so he walked back up to the campsite and he got the matches out from the backpack, and then he walked into the forest a ways that was right near the river and near their campsite, and he found this tree that was obviously dead, and he walked around gathering as much dry wood as he could, and he propped it up against this dead tree, and then he put as much kindling as he possibly could into this hole in the trunk of this dead tree. And after doing all this prep work, he got his matches out and he lit some of the kindling, and to his surprise, the tree caught on fire almost immediately. In fact, it burned so quickly and so big that Brandon had to run away so that he didn't catch on fire. And before long, all these trees are catching on fire, and he had to run all the way back to the campsite and wake Gina up. So he grabs Gina, they get up, and they run all the way over to the edge of the waterfall, and they turn, and they're just watching half an acre just completely erupt in flames. And all this black smoke is billowing up into the sky. And then about an hour later, after the fire had eventually just kind of died out on its own, Gina and Brandon heard the distant rumblings of a helicopter. They had seen the smoke and they were coming to rescue them. Gina and Brandon would be airlifted out of the ravine and would make full recoveries. John Donovan's body would be recovered 3 weeks later. His cause of death could not be determined. Some say that final note he left on May 14th, where he said he was going down to the creek to get water and then said, "Goodbye, I love you all," that was sort of a suicide note, that he actually threw himself off that cliff to end his suffering. Others say he just walked down to the edge of this waterfall and was trying to get a drink of water from the creek when he slipped and then fell over the edge to his death. But we'll never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that in 2005, when John Donovan was still alive and missing, had he been rescued, he would have left the valley with all of his supplies, including those matches, which would have meant in 2006, when Brandon and Gina found themselves in that ravine, there wouldn't have been a way to start that fire, and so they would have died. In fact, the helicopter pilot that did come up and rescue Brandon and Gina, he would say there was nobody planning to search that area. This was not an area they believed Brandon and Gina would be. And so it really was only because of that fire that those two lived. As such, the couple said they owe their lives entirely to John Donovan and his unbelievable sacrifice. On July 11th, 2006, a funeral was held for John in Virginia. 80 people showed up for it. Most of them were his hiking friends from his club. After the service was over, they all kind of poured out onto the cemetery lawn around John's gravesite. And as the bagpipes played Amazing Grace, Lynn Paget, the man who had done the first 100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail with John before his feet swelled up and he had to leave, he walked around the crowd handing out red Solo cups filled with a tiny bit of John's favorite whiskey. And then after making sure all of the adults had their drinks,
Lin went to the head of his very good friend's grave and he delivered a beautiful eulogy. In it, he tells the crowd that he thinks of John all the time, he misses him terribly, and at night he has the same dream. He's walking down this trail next to a stream, and then the stream bends off to the side, and as soon as he walks around the bend, he sees this green tarp. And he knows it's going to be John, and so he yells, "Hey comrade, hey comrade!" And as he's walking over to the tarp, he realizes John isn't there. All it is a tarp, a pack, and some shoes on a rock. As for Brandon and Gina, they did stay a couple after the ordeal, but they would ultimately break up 2 years later. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribes people have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, 3 brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the 3 brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water, submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the 3 brothers, they get their sluices up, and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning, they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town, and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party, eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water, and in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight, and so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline, they hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body, and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby, nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack. And that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people after this story broke were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose. I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got, because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River, and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin, or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp, and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days, and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by, and now John's past due, and so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area, and so this partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here, and so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp. And there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it, and then he hears it again, and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she'd already been gone for months and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley, a man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley, he finds a spot off of Flat River, he builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, They entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag, laying down, decapitated, right along the flat river inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp, and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. And then after you get their blindfold on, replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like this hat, like this flannel, and all sorts of stuff. There's mugs and stickers and sweatshirts. If you're interested in MrBallen merchandise, go to shopmrballen.com. If you're interested in upcoming deals and promotions relative to the shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.